If you were to look at the history of modern medicine, you would find stories of accidents. You would find stories of incompetence. You would find stories of doctors who tried to help but failed because they didn't know enough. But if you dig deeper, past the mistakes and the accidents, you occasionally find something much darker. You find stories where the failure wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. You are about to hear the story of one of the greatest corporate deceptions of our time. It is not a story about a rogue doctor or a shady back alley clinic. It is a story about one of the largest, most respected pharmaceutical companies in the world. It is a story about how they took a powerful, mind-altering chemical, a drug that they knew, based on their own internal data, was ineffective and dangerous for teenagers, and successfully sold it to millions of American families. They called it a miracle. They called it the solution to the teenage mental health crisis. But behind closed doors, in memos that they thought would never see the light of day, they called the truth commercially unacceptable. This is the story of Study 329. This is the story of the $3 billion fraud. And this is the story of the antidepressant scam that was sold to your children. To understand how a crime of this magnitude happens, you cannot just look at the drug. You have to look at the environment that produced it. You have to go back to the 1990s. The 90s were the golden age of the pharmaceutical industry. It was the era of the blockbuster drug. For decades, medicine had been a slow, steady business. But in the late 80s, the industry discovered something that changed everything: the direct to consumer advertisement. They realized that they didn't just have to sell to doctors. They could sell directly to you. They could sell to the patient. And the crown jewel of this new era was the antidepressant. When Prozac arrived on the scene, it changed the cultural conversation around sadness. Suddenly, depression wasn't just a reaction to a bad life or a tragic event. It was branded as a biological glitch, a chemical imbalance. The industry spent billions of dollars promoting the idea that depression was simply a lack of serotonin, and that these new drugs, the SRIs, were the precise scientific fix. It was a seductive story. It was clean, it was logical, and it was incredibly profitable. By 1998, the adult market for antidepressants was saturated. Practically every adult who walked into a doctor's office complaining of fatigue, sadness, or anxiety was walking out with a prescription. The market was flooded. But publicly traded corporations are not satisfied with stability. They need growth. They need to show their shareholders that next year will be more profitable this year. And when you have sold a pill to every adult who will take one, there is only one place left to go. You have to go after the children. In the late 90s, the pediatric market, children and teenagers, was the final frontier for big pharma. It was a massive, untapped demographic. Millions of teenagers struggle with mood swings, anxiety, and depression as a natural part of growing up. If the pharmaceutical industry could convince the medical establishment that these normal teenage struggles were actually a medical condition requiring a daily pill, they would unlock billions of dollars in new revenue. They would create customers not just for a month, but for a lifetime. But there was a problem, a scientific problem. The adolescent brain is not just a smaller version of an adult brain. It is undergoing a massive, chaotic reconstruction. It is flooded with hormones. It is pruning neural connections. It is incredibly sensitive. And historically, the FDA had been very hesitant to approve powerful psychotropic drugs for children because the safety data just wasn't there. The drug company SmithKline Beecham, which would later merge to become GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK, had a blockbuster drug called Paxil. Paxil was a huge hit with adults, but they wanted the kids. To get the FDA to approve Paxil for children and to convince doctors to prescribe it, they needed a clinical trial. They needed a piece of paper that said this drug is safe and effective for adolescents. So in 1994, they launched Protocol 329. Study 329 was a massive undertaking. It was a multi-center clinical trial conducted across the United States and Canada. They enrolled hundreds of adolescents diagnosed with major depressive disorder. The study design was standard. One group of teenagers would take Paxil. Another group would take an older antidepressant called imipramine, and a third group would take a placebo, a sugar pill. The executives at SmithKline Beecham waited for the results. They had the marketing campaigns ready. They had the sales reps ready. They just needed the data to cooperate. But when the data came back in 1998, it was a disaster. It was worse than a failure. It was a liability. The study measured efficacy, how well the drug worked using two primary scales. On both of these primary benchmarks, Paxil failed. The teenagers taking the drug showed no statistically significant improvement compared to the teenagers taking the sugar pill. In scientific terms, the drug was a dud. It did nothing to treat the depression. If that had been the only finding, it would have been bad for business. But it wouldn't have been a tragedy. But the safety data revealed something terrifying. The teenagers who were taking Paxil were experiencing severe adverse events at a rate much higher than the placebo group. They were suffering from something called akathisia. This is a medical term that describes a state of extreme inner restlessness. Patients describe it as the feeling of wanting to jump out of their own skin. It is a torture of the nervous system, and historically, akathisia is known to be a precursor to violence and suicide. When you make a person feel like they are burning from the inside out, they will do anything to stop the feeling. The data from study 329 showed that the kids on Paxil were becoming hostile, they were becoming aggressive, and most critically, they were exhibiting suicidal behavior. There were suicide attempts in the Paxil group. There were practically none in the placebo group. The conclusion was inescapable. The drug didn't work for teenagers, and it made some of them want to kill themselves. In a functioning ethical system, this is where the story ends. The company looks at the data, realizes the danger, and shuts down the program. They report the negative results to the FDA, and they move on. But that is not how the pharmaceutical industry worked in the 1990s. When the report reached the executives at SmithKline Beecham, they didn't see a safety crisis. They saw a marketing crisis. They had millions of dollars invested in this launch. They had projections to meet. So they made a decision that would haunt the medical world for decades. We know exactly what they were thinking because we have the documents. Years later, during the litigation that eventually exposed this fraud, lawyers unearthed a memo from 1998. It was a document from the company's central nervous system marketing team. In this memo, the executives acknowledged that the study results were disappointing, but then they wrote a sentence that should be printed in every business ethics textbook in the world. They wrote it would be commercially unacceptable to include a statement that efficacy had not been demonstrated, as this would undermine the profile of paroxetine. Let those words sink in. Commercially unacceptable. They didn't say it was scientifically inaccurate. They didn't say it was bad for patients. They said it was bad for commerce. It was bad for the brand. And because the truth was bad for business, they decided to manufacture a new truth. They initiated a cover-up, but they didn't just shred the documents. That would be too crude. Instead, they engaged in a sophisticated practice known as ghostwriting. Ghostwriting is one of the dirty secrets of medical publishing. Here is how it works. The pharmaceutical company hires a medical communications firm, essentially a PR agency for science. That firm hires a professional writer. The writer takes the raw data, the failed data, and spins it. They manipulate the statistics. They pick the secondary outcomes that look slightly better. They massage the language to downplay the risks. For study 329, SmithKline Beecham hired a writer named Sally Layden. She was not a doctor. She was not a researcher. She was a writer paid to produce a specific narrative. Her job was to turn a failed study into a success story. The most difficult part of her job was hiding the suicide attempts. You can't just delete them from the spreadsheet. That would be too easily detected. So she used a technique called coding. In medical trials, every side effect is given a code. If a patient vomits, you code it as nausea. If a patient has a headache, you code it as migraine. Sally Layden and the team at SmithKline Beecham took the severe psychiatric events, the suicide attempts, the aggression, the self-harm, and they coded them under a category called emotional lability. Emotional lability, it is a brilliant, evil euphemism. If a parent hears that a drug causes emotional lability, they think their teenager might be a little moody, they might cry a little more often. They do not think their teenager is going to try to overdose by hiding the suicide attempts under this vague label. They effectively erased the safety signal. They buried the bodies in the footnotes. Once the manuscript was polished and the data was distorted, they needed a face to sell it. A ghostwritten paper is worthless if it doesn't have a reputable name on the byline. So the company recruited 22 prominent academics, psychiatrists, and researchers from top universities. The lead author was Dr. Martin Keller from Brown University. He and 21 others agreed to put their names on the paper. Many of these doctors had significant financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. They were paid consulting fees, speaking fees, and grant money. In exchange, they lent their credibility to the lie. They became the key opinion leaders. In July 2001, the study was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. This is one of the most prestigious journals in the field. The title of the paper was Efficacy of Paroxetine in the Treatment of Adolescent Major Depression. The abstract, the summary that most doctors read, concluded with this sentence: paroxetine is generally well tolerated and effective for major depression in adolescents. It was a lie. It was a total fabrication, but it was now a peer-reviewed fact. Armed with this fraudulent paper, SmithKline Beecham, now GlaxoSmithKline, launched their assault on the American healthcare system. They didn't just put the paper in a library, they weaponized it. They printed hundreds of thousands of copies of the article. They gave these reprints to their army of sales representatives. These sales reps were young, attractive, and highly motivated by commission. They were sent into the offices of pediatricians and family doctors across the country. You have to understand the position of the average family doctor. They are busy. They see 30 or 40 patients a day. They do not have time to analyze the raw data of a clinical trial. They rely on the journals. They rely on the key opinion leaders. So when a friendly sales rep hands them a study from a top journal that says this drug is safe for kids, they believe it. The marketing campaign was relentless. The slogan was paroxetine, remarkable efficacy and safety. They hosted dinners for doctors. They flew doctors to resorts for educational conferences where they were lectured by the same key opinion leaders who had signed the fake study. They handed out toys, pens, and notepads. They saturated the environment, and it worked. It worked beyond their wildest dreams. In 2002 alone, doctors in the United States wrote over 2 million prescriptions for Paxil to children and adolescents. 2 million. Try to visualize that number. 2 million children, 2 million developing brains being flooded with a chemical that the company knew didn't work. 2 million families trusting that they were doing the right thing, trusting the science, trusting their doctors, and for the company, the gamble paid off. Paxil became a multi-billion-dollar earner. The executives received their bonuses. The stock price climbed. They had successfully opened the pediatric market. But while the money was rolling in, the tragedy was unfolding in homes across America. Parents began to notice strange changes in their children. Teenagers who had been depressed but passive were suddenly becoming agitated. They were pacing the hallways. They couldn't sleep. They were lashing out in anger. The akathisia that the company had hidden in the data was manifesting in real life. There were heartbreaking stories of children, good kids, kids with no history of violence, who committed suicide shortly after starting the medication. There were stories of kids who became homicidal. At first, these incidents were dismissed as anecdotal. Doctors would tell the parents, it's the depression talking, not the drug. They would often increase the dose, thinking the child needed more help, which only poured gasoline on the fire. But the reports kept coming. The FDA began to receive thousands of adverse event reports, and slowly the legal system began to wake up. In 2004, the Attorney General of New York, Eliot Spitzer, filed a lawsuit against GSK. He accused them of consumer fraud. He accused them of concealing the negative data from Study 329. This lawsuit was the first crack in the dam. Under pressure from the lawsuit and the mounting public outcry, the FDA was forced to re-examine the data. They went back and looked at the emotional lability category. They decoded the language, and when they did, they found exactly what Sally Layden had hidden. They found that children on Paxil were roughly twice as likely to experience suicidal thinking and behavior as those on the placebo. In late 2004, the FDA issued a black box warning for all antidepressants. This is the most serious warning a drug can carry. It explicitly warned that these drugs increased the risk of suicidality in children and adolescents. It was a vindication for the parents who had lost their children, but it was too late for them. And amazingly, even after the black box warning, the prescriptions didn't stop. The narrative was so deeply embedded, the marketing had been so effective, that many doctors continued to prescribe the drug off label. They had been told for years that it was safe. And a warning label couldn't undo a decade of conditioning. But the government wasn't done with GSK. The Department of Justice had launched a massive investigation. They weren't just looking at Paxil. They were looking at the entire corporate culture of GlaxoSmithKline. The investigation dragged on for years. It involved millions of pages of documents. It involved whistleblowers from inside the company who risked their careers to tell the truth. Finally, in July 2012, the reckoning arrived. In a press conference that should have been the lead story on every news channel in the world, the Department of Justice announced that GlaxoSmithKline would plead guilty to criminal charges. They admitted to failing to report safety data. They admitted to the fraud regarding Paxil. They admitted to illegally marketing other drugs like Wellbutrin and Avandia. As part of the plea deal, GSK agreed to pay a fine of $3 billion. $3 billion it was and remains the largest healthcare fraud settlement in U.S. history. The Assistant Attorney General called it a historic victory for public health. But was it? If you look at the math, the victory starts to look like a defeat. During the years that GSK was running these scams, during the years they were selling Paxil to children and hiding the safety data, they generated tens of billions of dollars in revenue. Paxil alone brought in billions every single year. When you compare the $3 billion fine to the profits they made by breaking the law, the fine looks less like a punishment and more like a commission. It was a kickback. It was the cost of doing business. Did anyone go to prison? No. The executives who wrote the commercially unacceptable memo were not handcuffed. The ghostwriter, Sally Layden, was not charged. The 22 doctors who put their names on the fraudulent study kept their jobs at their universities. Dr. Martin Keller continued to be a respected figure in psychiatry. The corporation wrote the check, issued a press release apologizing for past procedures, and went right back to work. The stock price barely moved. Wall Street understood the message clearly. You can defraud the public, you can endanger children, and as long as the profits exceed the fine, you will be rewarded. But the story doesn't end with the settlement. There was one loose end that needed to be tied up: the study itself. For years, the fraudulent Study 329 remained in the medical literature. It was still cited. It was still used to justify prescribing. The Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry refused to retract it. They claimed that retracting it would be too complicated, so a group of independent researchers decided to do something unprecedented. Under an initiative called Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials, they demanded access to the original raw data. They wanted to see the handwritten case report forms that Sally Layden had summarized after a long battle. They got the data in 2015. 14 years after the original lie was published, the reanalysis was released in the British Medical Journal. The findings were damning. The independent researchers looked at the exact same data as the GSK team, but without the spin, without the coding tricks. The results were the complete opposite. They concluded that Paxil was ineffective for depression in adolescents and that the harms were significant. They proved mathematically that the original paper was a fabrication. It was the smoking gun. It proved that the medical consensus on treating teenage depression had been built on a foundation of sand. And yet the damage is still with us. The legacy of Study 329 is not just in the past. It reshaped how we think about mental health. It normalized the idea of medicating children for emotional distress. It created a culture where the first response to a sad teenager is a prescription pad. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is the recent collapse of the scientific theory that started it all. Remember the chemical imbalance theory. The idea that depression is caused by low serotonin and these pills fix it. In July 2022, researchers at University College London published a massive umbrella review of all the major studies on serotonin and depression. Their conclusion was a bombshell that should have shattered the industry. They found no consistent evidence that low serotonin causes depression. For 30 years, we were told that these drugs were fixing a biological deficit. We were shown cartoons of neurotransmitters. We were told it was like insulin for diabetes. But the science doesn't support that. The entire serotonin theory was a hypothesis that the marketing departments turned into a fact because it helped sell pills. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a generation of young people who have been medicated based on a lie. It leaves us with a medical system that is so entangled with corporate money that it cannot separate marketing from science. The story of the antidepressant scam is a lesson in skepticism. It teaches us that when a corporation tells you they have a miracle cure, you have to look at the incentives. You have to ask who paid for the study. You have to ask what they are hiding in the footnotes. Because the executives at GlaxoSmithKline showed us who they really are. They showed us that when faced with a choice between the safety of your children and the commercial acceptability of their product, they will choose the product every single time. They didn't just sell a pill, they sold a worldview. They sold the idea that human suffering is a mechanical problem that can be fixed with a corporate product. They colonized our understanding of sadness. The scam of Study 329 is technically over. The fine has been paid. The study has been debunked. But the playbook is still in use. The ghostwriters are still typing. The key opinion leaders are still giving lectures at resorts. And the sales reps are still smiling in the waiting room. The only defense we have is to know the history, to remember the name Study 329, and to never forget that in the eyes of a $300 billion industry, we are not patients to be cured. We are markets to be captured. And if they can't find a market in adults, they will come for the children, and they will do it with a smile, a glossy brochure, and a lie that is too profitable to check.